Hi, I'm Skinny Cheeks, and in this video, we'll be setting out to cover the top DPS sets in the Elder Scrolls Online. In the past, I've usually done countdowns of the top sets, but with each new DLC, ESO has been slowly moving towards a more balanced approach when it comes to viable gear options, and it's really hard to just say X set is the best set. So with this update, I decided to go with the tiered approach. Some sets aren't the best at anything, but can handle many different types of situations well, so something like Order's Wrath or Mother's Sorrow, for example, just nice stats on these all around, and they can be used pretty much everywhere, but don't necessarily top the charts for any specific encounter. I like to refer to these kinds of sets as set and forget sets. Just put them on and play and don't worry about anything else. And then on the other hand, you have sets that are very specialized, ones that might be bad for some scenarios, but could actually be the best option you could go with for others. A good example of this would be Mechanical Acuity, really great for blowing up enemies quickly and can often be the best option for those types of coordinated scenarios, but over the course of a longer fight, the long cooldown really makes this set not very appealing to wear, and it will get lower DPS than most of your other options. So the aim of this video is to go through a few different tiers, and then I'll have some special tags on each of the sets we talk about so that you will know how they are best used. Also, this video will just be focused on the 5-piece sets. I'll probably do an updated guide for arena sets, monster sets, and mythics for update 36. Also, keep in mind, at the end of the day, this is just my opinion. You might have a set that gets you great results and you disagree with the tier, and that's okay. This is just a general guideline based on what I've seen from lots of dungeon and trial runs. I also won't be going through the full tier list in this video. I started out doing that and it ended up being really long, so I'll just be doing B tier through S tier here, but I do have the full chart up on my website at skinnycheeks.gg if you want to check that out. And last thing before we start, a quick shout out to ESOsets.com and ESO University for all the tooltips listed here for the sets and skills. I'll have them both linked in the description. Really great resources for looking up info. I use them both all the time. And with all that out of the way, let's go ahead and get into the tiers. Starting with the B tier, first we have Burning Spellwave. This is a light dungeon set from the City of Ash dungeon. It's one of the early base game dungeons. The 5-piece bonus on this is when you deal damage with a flame damage ability, you apply the burning status effect to the enemy and increase your weapon and spell damage by 490 for 8 seconds. These effects can occur once every 12 seconds. So averaged out over the course of a longer encounter, this isn't anything too special. I'd probably rank it in the C tier for that kind of general use, but for quick burst encounters, it is very strong and you can trigger it at will by dealing flame damage, and then you get 8 seconds of a very nice amount of weapon and spell damage. This has been fairly popular for AoE trash setups to get a nice quick burst, and definitely better suited for a magicka stacking setup since it does have that line of magicka on it. If you are instead stacking into stamina, you can get very similar results with this next set. We have Briarheart. This is a medium overland set that drops in Hrothgar. The 5-piece bonus on this is kind of similar, except it triggers from crit damage. It gives 450 weapon and spell damage, and it lasts for 10 seconds, and this can occur once every 15 seconds. So like Burning Spellwave, this isn't the strongest for longer encounters, as the average damage you'll get isn't anything too crazy, but for shorter burst encounters, it can be pretty nice, and the heal on it can make it an okay option for solo play too. Alright, next up for the B tier is Elfbane. This is a heavy set from Cyrodiil. You can also purchase off of the guild traders. The 5-piece bonus on this one extends the duration of your flame damage over time abilities by 5 seconds. So for general use, this is not the greatest set in today's game. Not only is it heavy, which hinders the way that you can set up with it, but also, they just extended a lot of the dot timers with update 35, and so the relative increase you get with this is a bit worse than it was in previous patches. However, this set can really shine when paired with a few specific setups. So the Destruction Staff Ultimate Fiery Rage, this normally lasts 7 seconds, but is pushed up to 12 seconds with this set. This is such a strong ultimate, and getting 5 extra seconds out of it can be incredibly strong for some scenarios where you're trying to nuke stuff down really quickly. If you start going too long past that time, the set quickly starts dropping off, but for that first 15 seconds or so, this combo can be incredible to use on your back bar. Some other interesting interactions: it will increase the Dragonite's standard ultimate to 25 seconds, and maybe even more interesting, it also increases their magma shell from 10 seconds to 15 seconds. So this can be used for survival and some niche scenarios as well. This is definitely one of those hyper specialized sets we mentioned earlier. I don't usually recommend it for general use, though it can be okay there if you just like the theme of it. But used in the right way, this can get some pretty awesome results. All right, next up is Aegis Caller. This is a medium DLC dungeon set from Unhallowed Grave. The 5-piece bonus summons a lesser Aegis that spins around dealing bleed damage, and it hits pretty hard. I went back and forth between ranking this B tier or A tier. I was really torn between the two. There were just a couple of things that held it back in the B tier for me. The first is the stamina recovery line on the 3-piece bonus. It isn't a huge deal. The set is still strong, but not quite as strong as it would be if it had a crit line or a weapon and spell damage line there. And then the trigger condition as well. You have to deal crit damage with a martial melee attack. So it is a bit RNG and you are kind of pigeonholed into melee with this, but it shouldn't ever take too long as you're set up right. But if you are wanting it for that quick burst, it could be annoying on specific ad waves where maybe you get unlucky and don't get that melee crit right away. And then after it spawns, there's also a delay before it starts dealing damage, and then it doesn't move either once it spawns. So if the ads move after it spawns in, you're just going to miss out on the damage. So yeah, lots of negatives there, but the proc itself does hit really hard. So when you do have it consistently damaging your target, it can do really well. And it's also a very nice size AoE, so not just single target damage you're getting from it either. Overall, really nice set. I think it is probably A tier for a lot of situations, but like I said, just a few of those drawbacks held it back slightly for me. Just be mindful of those things whenever you're using it. All right, the next two sets I'll pair together here. We have Mother's Sorrow and Leviathan. These are essentially the same set, but they're differentiated by a line of magicka and stamina. So Leviathan is a medium armor set from a base game dungeon, Crypt of Hearts, and Mother's Sorrow is a light armor overland set from Deshawn. Not too much to say about these really, just nice static stats that you have at all times. Don't have to worry about keeping up stacks or doing anything special. They aren't the meta sets in today's game, but they're still very strong and they're very easy to pick up early. Both of these are very versatile and definitely fall into that set and forget category. Next up, we have Yondir's Might. This is a medium set from Kind's Aegis. The 5-piece bonus on this one stacks up to 410 weapon and spell damage, and as long as you are continuing to deal crit damage once every 5 seconds, you can keep that amount going as long as you want. Or you can do a fully charged heavy attack and convert that into 630 weapon and spell damage for 15 seconds, but once that 15 seconds is up, you will have to build up your initial stacks again. Not really too much to say about this set. It isn't a bad set, it just feels outclassed by a lot of the other options that we have in the game. So if you have it already and you want to use it, you can get decent results with it, but I wouldn't really go out of my way to try and farm this and put it together. Next up, we have Medusa. This is a heavy base game dungeon set from Arx Corinium. Just a ton of crit chance here, and then minor forces also added on the 5-piece bonus. The nice thing about this set is that it's all available up front. No need to build stacks or anything to obtain that bonus. But the main drawback is that it is a heavy set, so you are pretty limited in how you can wear it. Especially if you are using a mythic that takes up a jewelry slot, you'll end up having to have at least one heavy body piece. Not the end of the world, but also not ideal for min-maxing your damage. I like to pass this set along to a lot of my characters for daily random normals, as it gives me an easy way to set up to get decent damage and flexible bar space to not have to slot a skill for minor force. Alright, next up is Armor of Truth. This is another heavy base game dungeon set. This one comes from Darkshade Caverns. This set is a bit underrated in my opinion. It isn't anything that will blow you away compared to some of the other upper tier sets we'll get into later, but the 5-piece bonus of 460 weapon and spell damage does not have a cooldown, so if you are hitting multiple enemies that are off balance, you can have really high uptimes on that bonus. So every time you hit an enemy that is off balance, that 10-second timer just refreshes. It does have a stamina line, so I wouldn't recommend this one on magicka stacking builds, and as I said, it is heavy, so like Medusa, you are a bit limited in how you can set up with it. You also need to make sure that off balance is actually being applied to the enemies, otherwise you won't be triggering this bonus. So those things hold it back a little bit, but I still think it's a pretty solid set overall, and one that's often overlooked. Next up is Dragon Guard Elite. This is a medium armor overland set found in Southern Elsewhere. This one stacks up really high in crit chance, up to 2750, which is the equivalent of about 12.5% crit chance. So actually really high on the 5-piece bonus. However, it does have some drawbacks. Again, another set with the stamina recovery line on the 4-piece bonus. So comparing that 5-piece bonus to another set that gives you crit chance, you do have to account for the missing damage there. And so that 5-piece is a little less attractive when you factor that in. And then the biggest downside to the set is that you can't trigger it from flanking the enemy, and for PvE purposes, this is usually where we stand as a DPS for dungeons and trials. There are some exceptions to that though, and this can be a strong option in those exceptions, but that limitation holds it back for many scenarios. Next up is Plague Break. This is a medium armor rewards for the worthy set, and you can also buy it off the guild traders. The 5-piece bonus is pretty cool. It essentially puts a dot on whatever target you hit with direct damage, and then for PvE purposes, when that target dies, if they have that dot on them still, they will explode. Now the damage from that is not too high, but it has a special condition where it increases in damage the more nearby enemies they are. So this is one of those sets that can be really bad on some encounters, particularly longer encounters or ones without many adds. But on the other hand, it can be very strong for situations where there are a lot of adds stacked up, as long as some of them are dying within that 10-second window. They did change the cooldown on this with the most recent patch to 20 seconds. So if you don't kill an enemy within that initial 10-second window, it will lose that dot, and then it'll be another 10 seconds after the dot runs off before you can apply it again. So the set lost a little bit of its oomph from that, but it can still be very nice as long as you're blowing up a bunch of adds quickly. And then finally for the beats here, we'll go through a few sets that are specific to the Warden class. So I wouldn't recommend these outside of that, but they can be very strong in some niche setups for the Warden. So we have Frostbite, Drozakar's Claws, and Blood Drinker. Frostbite is pretty limited in its effectiveness to only Frost mages, and this works very well with the Frost Warden, as you can get a lot of your damage set up as Frost to make that 5-piece bonus pretty decent. And then for Drozakar and Blood Drinker, this can be used on your more bleed-focused Wardens. I actually recently did a video covering that. If you want to check it out, it'll be down in the description, but I really like Drozakar a lot for a standard 2-bar build focused into bleeds. And then Blood Drinker, I got really good results with an Oaken Soul 1-bar setup. So a bit niche with their uses, but definitely thought they were still worth mentioning here. All right, now we're moving up to the A tier. These are going to be some of the most common sets that you will see run in the end game in ESO. Some are better for some situations than others, but I think they all at least have a strong place somewhere, and that's why they're in the A tier. First up is Pillar of Nirn. This is a medium armor DLC dungeon set found in Falkreath Hold. The 5-piece bonus creates a fissure underneath the enemy after 1 second, dealing bleed damage to all enemies within 2.5 meters and causing them to bleed for additional bleed damage over 10 seconds. This effect can occur once every 10 seconds. So this is just a really nice option for a few reasons. First, the damage from the proc is very strong, putting it on par with some of the other percent boost kinds of sets. And the proc is easy to trigger. It only requires dealing damage, so it's guaranteed to trigger every 10 seconds as long as you are dealing damage. This also means that you can single bar it either on the front bar or the back bar, and this gives a lot of flexibility when running this set. The main downside is that it can proc on a side enemy that you don't want it to, and so sometimes the damage could be wasted there. And also it does have a brief 1 second period from when you trigger it until it hits the enemy. So if you get unlucky and the enemy happens to move right at that time, you could miss the proc altogether. Fortunately, 1 second is pretty short, so that doesn't happen too often. And then the radius on the AoE is very small too, so if stuff is pretty much stacked right on top of each other, you might get some AoE damage from this, but with it only being 2.5 meters, it is typically more of a single target set. The stam line is also not the most ideal for Magicka builds, but really not too much to complain about this one. It's just a really solid set all around. Next up is Kinra's Wrath. This is a medium armor DLC dungeon set found in Black Drake Villa. Great 2 to 4 piece bonuses, and then for the 5-piece, this is a stack based set that triggers from light or heavy attacks and grants you major berserk once you are at the 5 stacks. And as long as you aren't going 5 seconds without a light or heavy attack, you can keep up this bonus indefinitely. This is still a very strong set, however, it does lose a tiny bit of value if you have sorcerers in your group dropping their Storm Atronachs, as that gives the same buff, major berserk, for 8 seconds at a time. And so that extra boost will be a little bit wasted there. It can also be a bit tricky to keep the stacks up in some scenarios, especially if only running this on 1 bar as it commonly is. So many have opted to go with an easier option such as Pillar of Nirn that is a bit more consistent. But Kinra's is still a very strong set if you are utilizing it properly. Next up is Zogvin's Warband. This is another medium armor set, this one from the Frostvault DLC dungeon. This one is kind of similar to Medusa in that it gives you minor force and crit chance on the 5-piece, but it works a little differently in that you have to build up the stacks from dealing crit damage, and once you are at max stacks, you get that minor force. Generally, this will build up pretty quickly as you are critting quite often in PvE, and this can be any crit damage to trigger it. It doesn't require a specific type of damage, so all of your dots and everything going will work for it. And then once it's up, as long as you keep critting at least once every 5 seconds, then this will just keep refreshing the timer. So this set is really nice when you need a little extra bar space to slot something specific. You don't want to have to run a skill like Barbed Trap or Channeled Acceleration for that minor force. And since it is stack based with a timer, it can be front barred, allowing for more flexibility with your build options as long as you're not staying on your back bar too long and letting the stacks fall off. Next up, we have Order's Wrath. This is a craftable set, really solid stats all the way through. Great 2 to 4 piece and lots of crit chance and crit damage on the 5 piece. Very similar stats to Medusa, but a couple of things here that push it to A tier for me instead of B tier. First, with it being craftable, you have the flexibility to make any weight you want with it. So you can fully customize exactly which pieces you want to be light or medium armor based on your scenario. Whereas with Medusa, you are very limited by it being heavy armor. Also, the crit damage bonus is a little less than minor force, but it is a unique bonus, so it will stack with minor force as long as you have that sourced in some other way. This is one of those sets that is a perfect example of a set and forget kind of set. The only real downsides are if you're over the crit damage cap already, you may waste some of that 8% bonus. And while for some scenarios it can be a positive that you have all the stats up front with no stacks to build up, it can also be looked at as a negative for other scenarios, since you do have to have this as an always active kind of set and you can't just front bar it like some of the stacking sets we've recently gone through. It also doesn't reach quite as high on the stats as some of those stacking sets, but for a lot of scenarios, those stacks are hard to keep up, or by the time you get them up, the enemies are nearly dead, so a set like this can definitely outperform those at times. I think this is one of the most versatile sets in the game right now, and definitely one of my favorites. Not only good in some end-game scenarios, but great to start out with too, since it is craftable. So if you don't have the traits research to make it yourself, you can ask a guildmate to make it or pick it up off the guild traders. Next up is Berserking Warrior. This is a heavy trial set found in Hellra Citadel. It has great 2 to 4 piece bonuses, and the 5 piece bonus is another stacking set, this one just stacking up crit chance. That 2410 that it maxes out at is about 11% crit chance, so really solid stats all around here. There are a couple of drawbacks to the set, the first one being the weight. Like the other heavy sets, you are limited in how you can build with it since it needs to be on the weapons and the jewelry, so with the mythic jewelry piece you would get stuck having to wear a heavy piece on the body. And then the trigger condition for this set as well, stacks are only built up with martial melee damage, so that's melee damage that's physical, poison, disease, or bleed. It's not too tough of a condition, but for some setups that will pretty much mean only your light attacks are building it up, and so you want to make sure that your weaving is really good there. But solid stats all around, still one of the strongest options in today's game. The next set is a new light armor set from the Graven Deep dungeon called Grave Inevitability. Again, great 2 to 4 piece bonuses, and then the 5 piece is another stacking set. This one very similar to Kinra's Wrath, except instead of major berserk for you and minor berserk for your allies, it's major force for you and minor force for your allies. 20% crit damage is really strong. However, this is a common buff that you'll get from your allies in a coordinated group through Warhorn. So the more coordinated that group is, the less benefit you'll see from this. But it isn't uncommon to join a pug run and get no Warhorns, or not that many. Maybe you have under 25% uptime on them. And in situations like that, this could be one of the strongest options in the game. It could also be nice as a support DPS option for more AoE heavy boss fights where your teammates might want some more bar space for extra AoE abilities. So this would let them drop their minor force skill for something else that will deal more cleave damage. So definitely some nice uses for this set, I think. It just probably won't be great for selfish damage for the more coordinated groups. All right, next up for the A tier is Deadly Strike. This is a medium armor set from Cyrodiil and also can be purchased on the guild traders. It has great 2 to 4 piece bonuses, and the 5 piece increases the damage of your damage over time and channeled abilities by 15%. For most setups, this is a pretty mediocre set. Having your dots boosted is nice, but usually that won't be enough to make that 15% worth it. However, for Templars, this set really shines as their main spammable puncturing strikes and their main execute Radiant Destruction are also boosted on top of boosting all of their dots. This creates a situation where that 5 piece bonus is boosting enough of your damage where it ends up on par with these other A tier sets, if not better for some situations. And since it's purchasable too as a Templar, you can get this right out of the gate. It is a bit expensive for the weapons, but if you want to run it on the body pieces, they're generally pretty reasonable. And then one last thing, if you are using the Bloodthirst or Rapid Strike spammable from the dual wield line, these are also boosted by this set. So in that scenario, depending on how much of the rest of your damage is coming from dots, it could be a nice set for you even on other classes besides Templar, but Templar is definitely the most common class you see this on. Next up is Azurblight Reaper. This is a medium armor set from the Lair of Marsalok DLC dungeon. Not the best 3 and 4 piece bonuses you could ask for, but in many situations that 5 piece bonus can more than make up for it. When you deal damage with the damage over time effect, you apply a stack of Blight Seed to your target for 5 seconds. At 20 stacks, the Blight Seed explodes, dealing 1745 disease damage to the target and nearby enemies, scaling off the higher of your weapon or spell damage. An enemy can only have 1 instance of Blight Seed at a time. An enemy that has reached 20 stacks cannot be infected with Blight Seed for 2 seconds. So essentially how it works is that every dot you have going will be building stacks on all the enemies they're hitting, and once those stacks reach 20, they pop in an AoE. So the more dots you have, the faster that builds to that 20 stacks. And the more enemies they are, the more AoE explosions you have going off. If you have enough dots in your kit, this can be fairly strong even with just 2 enemies, but when you start going beyond that, it can start getting into nutty territory. Great for some of the high health ad waves to nuke everything down, and also really good on a lot of boss fights too if there are extra enemies to benefit from this popping on more than one target. The main downside is that this set works as a debuff on the enemy, and therefore you'll usually just want one person only to wear it. You can share stacks and build them up faster if you have more than one person in it, but only one person still gets each explosion, and you still have to wait on the cooldown. So I think it can still be okay with 2 people in it, but beyond that, it's gonna really start to diminish in its results. Also, the 3 and 4 piece bonuses, as I mentioned, aren't ideal. So for scenarios where you aren't getting a ton of damage from the proc, you'd be better off running something with better stats. So definitely a bit situational for this set, but maybe not quite as situational as some people tend to think. Works really well for many encounters in the game. The next A tier set is Mechanical Acuity. I mentioned this one in the intro. This is a craftable set and is one of the more specialized sets in the game. For general set and forget use, it's probably D tier or lower. Many better options you can go with for standard encounters. However, if you are making specialized builds for certain boss nukes or ad wave nukes, this is one of the best sets in the game. A lot of people immediately said, oh, that's a dead set now, when they changed that 5-piece bonus on it to not immediately give 100% crit chance. And I actually caught a bit of flack for pushing back against that and saying, no, this is still really good. But essentially how it works now is that you build up to that 100% crit chance 20% at a time. So you can really build into your other stats, and with your acuity setup, have a lower overall crit chance. And the cool thing is that each time you move up 20%, that 4-second timer on it starts over again. So your effective crit chance for short burst encounters can be really amazing with this set, and still nuke stuff just as good, if not better, than the old version of this set. And sometimes you'll get lucky after like 3 seconds of sitting at 95% crit chance and hit a non-crit, and bam, you'll have another 4 seconds at 100% at that point. I definitely say this one is a little bit more geared towards sweatier loadouts and optimizing for individual encounters within dungeons or trials, but it definitely still has a place and is really effective if you use it the right way. All right, then the final 2 sets for the A tier, I'll put these together as they're pretty much the same set. We have Vicious Serpent and False God's Devotion. These are both trial sets. Vicious Serpent is medium and drops in the Craglorn trials, and False Gods is light and comes from Sunspire. The damage bonuses on these are the same for both sets, but Vicious Serpent reduces the cost of your stamina abilities by 8% and gives 2454 stamina back when enemies that you've recently damaged die, and False Gods does the same but with Magicka instead. For pure damage, these two aren't the greatest. They're decent, about on par with Mother's Sorrow or Leviathan, the crit sets we talked about earlier, and that's assuming that you are benefiting from that Minor Slayer 3-piece bonus and not pairing it with another trial set that already has that bonus. But for the amount of damage that they do offer, for them to also be incredible for sustain, it's hard to not still rank them highly. Sure, for coordinated dungeon or trial groups, they aren't nearly as popular as they used to be. There are lots of other ways to manage that sustain game, but for pug runs and solo play, these can really be a breath of fresh air for those that have had sustain issues. I definitely don't use these as often as I used to, but I think they still have a place for a lot of players in today's ESO. Alright, we made it. We are here in the S tier. These are generally the best of the best sets, and you'll want at least one of these sets going to pair with one of those A tier sets. So before we get into them, let me give a little insight into that thought process. So these sets we are going to go through are all trial sets, and they all have that minor slayer bonus that we were just talking about. For PvE DPS builds, if possible, you generally always want one of your sets to have this bonus. It is around double the value of your standard 2 to 4 piece bonuses like crit chance and weapon and spell damage, and really pushes the sets that have it up a notch. However, this bonus cannot stack with itself, so what that means is that after you have one set with this, your pool of options then generally opens up past the S tier to all of those great A tier sets that don't have the minor slayer bonus. So while these 5-piece bonuses in the S tier are really strong, most of them aren't actually any better than the A tier 5-piece bonuses. It's just that they have that minor slayer bonus that elevates their total power up. So to sum it up, most of the time you'll pick one of these S tier sets and pair it with an A tier set. You could also pair 2 S tier sets together in some situations, but often you get just as good, if not better results pairing an S tier with an A tier. And of course, there is an exception to everything we just said, and that is with the Oaken Soul Mythic. Oaken Soul gives that minor slayer bonus that is normally only on trial sets. So if you are wearing this, that S tier and A tier are essentially merged together, and you no longer are in a position where you have to pick one of the minor slayer sets if you want the top results. Personally, I think this was a really cool idea and really helps a lot with the kind of build diversity that you can get with Oaken Soul. Lots of sets can be paired together from that A tier that you might not have wanted to before because you were missing that minor slayer bonus. So yeah, just wanted to take a moment to clarify the key difference in the A tier and the S tier and explain how those work together and how they're essentially just one big tier if you are using Oaken Soul or if you've already chosen one set from the S tier. So hopefully that all makes sense. The first set we'll talk about here is Arms of Reliquin. This is a medium armor trial set that comes from Cloudrest. The proc damage on the 5-piece has the highest top end of any proc set in the game. However, ZOS has done a pretty good job of keeping that in check with other limitations. First, it's based on stacks that you have to build up with your light and heavy attacks. In this case, at 10 stacks, it will reach that full ticking amount. And as long as you don't go 5 seconds without a light or heavy attack with this set active, then you will remain at those 10 stacks. So there is a ramp up period to get to that really juicy damage. So already that eliminates Reliquin from short burst encounters. The other big drawback is that it's only single target damage. You can apply it to more than one target, but you have to keep light attacking back and forth between targets, and generally it would be a huge hassle to try and keep it up that way when we have other AoE options available to us. I know I've been mostly talking about the negatives so far, but there are plenty of encounters in the game where single target damage is your main focus and where you can fairly easily keep your stacks up on this. And in those scenarios, it's really hard to beat out Reliquin. Just really hard hitting 5-piece bonus. Another thing, if you do want to run this set on your front bar instead of having it always active, you can do so, but there will be a couple of things to keep in mind. First, that 5-second window we talked about earlier. I generally try and only do 3 back bar skills at a time to give myself plenty of wiggle room to not let my stacks fall off with these kinds of sets with 5-second timers. And then the second thing in this one is unique to Reliquin. This set actually ticks once every second, but it also ticks once every time you light or heavy attack. So I've seen some people look at the tooltip and not quite understand how the damage is as good as it is, but essentially you are usually getting 2 ticks per second with this. If you only have it front barred, keep in mind you will be giving up some of those double ticks while you're on your back bar refreshing those abilities. It's not the end of the world, definitely doable, but for some setups that have you spending more time on your back bar, it may not be worth it to set up this way. There's also one little bug that you may run into with these double ticks. If you weave too fast due to the way that tick rates are calculated in ESO, you can actually go too fast to get your double tick. So it's registering your light attack for some reason before that full 1 second has gone by. This is only really an issue for a very small percent of the player base that can weave light attacks and skills at nearly perfect speeds, but it is why you'll sometimes see Reliquin damage a bit lower for those that are weaving really quickly. Even if that's happened to you, it's still a really strong set, but just something to keep in mind. For the perfected version, if you are using a stamina stacking build, you do get a small bump from that extra perfected stamina bonus, but it won't make a huge difference, only a little over 1% more damage from that. If you're using this with a magicka stacking build, then that stam line might be nice to bolster your off resource pool, but will make no difference in your total overall damage. So even if you can't get into some veteran runs for the perfected, I definitely still recommend picking up the normal version of Reliquin. All right, next up, we'll stick with the Cloud Rest trial. This will be the light armor set in there, Mantle of Sororia. The 5-piece bonus on this also works in stacks that are triggered with your light and heavy attacks, but instead of proc damage like Reliquin, this is a boost to your weapon and spell damage. Whenever you have the 5-piece bonus active and you use a light or heavy attack, you'll summon a ring on the ground, and that ring will be your own personal buff circle to build these stacks. And then when the ring is gone, you have 5 seconds to get another ring to continue refreshing your timer, otherwise the built up stacks will fall off. This set had fallen out of favor for quite a bit, but with update 35, they reduced the timer on it to 8 seconds to make it a little quicker to respawn that ring. They also boosted up the stacking weapon and spell damage on the 5-piece bonus, and they changed the 4-piece bonus from a Magicka line to weapon and spell damage. So really nice buffs across the board for Sororia, which really pushed it back into that S tier where it would have been like a low-end A tier or high-end B tier kind of set before. So the maxed out 5-piece bonus gives you 630 weapon and spell damage now, which can be kept up indefinitely as long as you are keeping your ring spawned. So unlike Reliquin, this is a very nice set for AoE damage since the weapon and spell damage boosts all of your damage. For that perfected bonus, the same principle applies as with the Reliquin set, except this one is Magicka instead of stamina. So for Magicka stacking setups, a little bit over 1% more damage for having it perfected, and no extra damage here for stamina setups for using the perfected version. Like Reliquin, even if you can't get a hold of the perfected one, still a really nice set to farm on normal and get a hold of. All right, next up we have Sulkazan's Torment. This is a medium trial set from Rock Grove. Really great 2 to 4 piece bonuses on this one, and the perfected bonus actually makes a little more difference than the last 2 sets since you get more crit chance. So somewhere around a 2.5% DPS gain for that one. This set is specialized and situational like many of the other S tier options. The 5-piece bonus is when an enemy you recently damaged dies, you leave behind a Vengeful Soul for 6 seconds. You can only create 1 Vengeful Soul at a time. Touching the soul increases your critical chance by 2160 and your critical damage by 12% for 30 seconds. And this timer can be refreshed early by just grabbing another soul. So as long as you have a somewhat steady flow of enemies dying, the 5-piece bonus on this is just so good. Almost 10% crit chance paired with 12% crit damage. The obvious downside to this set is that there are lots of fights in the game where you aren't going to have enemies dying frequently enough to keep the bonus up. It is a super popular set for AoE trash encounters since you have plenty of bodies there, and also for certain boss encounters where there are adds dying that are in close enough to easily pick up their souls. Really one of my favorite sets in the game as long as I can keep that bonus up. Sometimes I can derp out a bit and forget I'm wearing it and stop collecting my souls, so don't be like me if you have this going, but just a really great set to have overall. Lots of in-game situations where this can really shine, and it's also great for quick and easy dungeon runs too. Next up, we have the Light Trial set from Dreadsail Reef. This one is Whirl of the Depths, again with the really nice 2 to 4 piece bonuses and a pretty strong perfected crit chance bonus as well. For the 5-piece proc damage, this one works in a pretty unique way. It starts off as a very weak single target dot for 8 seconds, and then after that 8 seconds is up, or if the target dies with the dot on them, then a whirlpool is dropped on the ground underneath that target. It has a 5-meter radius and deals really strong AoE damage for 6 seconds. And then there is 4 seconds of downtime on that before you can trigger the set again. So once every 18 seconds total. The overall proc damage from this is not quite as strong as what you'd get from something like Reliquin. However, since it is a 5-meter AoE, this is not limited to single target like Reliquin is. So this can be really strong on fights where that whirlpool will be hitting multiple enemies. The big downside to this set is that almost 90% of its proc damage comes in that 6-second window when the whirlpool is down. And that can only happen once every 18 seconds. So as long as you are consistently hitting with that whirlpool, then your damage from this set will be very good. However, the whirlpool does not move, so you can get unlucky and have enemies move out of it as it drops, and then your damage is going to tank. So best suited for AoE scenarios and also ones that have limited movement or at least controlled movement. Those fights where you are jumping around all the time or the bosses are porting around, you're probably not going to get the best results with this one. At best, it would just be inconsistent where you'd get lucky with it at times and unlucky others. But for the places you can use it, it's very strong, and yeah, the AoE whirlpool really hits like a truck. I will say I probably only recommend this set if you do need the Minor Slayer bonus. If you already have the Minor Slayer bonus going with your other set, I generally think the other A tier options will work a bit better than this if you need some extra proc damage. This one is kind of low S tier, but still makes the cut due to that Minor Slayer bonus. And then finally, the last 2 sets of the S tier, we'll talk about these together since they function in a very similar way. We have the Light Armor set from Rock Grove, Besides Mania, and the medium medium armor set from Dreadsail Reef, Coral Riptide. Both of these sets work by a scaling increase in damage as one of your resources gets lower. So for Basai, this is a % damage done increase based on missing magicka, and for Coral Riptide, it's a weapon and spell damage increase based on your missing stamina. Since missing stamina is a bit more risky, they made it to where you max out your bonus on this one with 33% stamina remaining, so you don't have to drop it all the way down to get all the weapon and spell damage. Whereas with Basai, you can't actually hit that full 12% on it because you won't ever have 0 magicka left, but you can get really close to that. So if utilized well, both of these sets are still very strong. However, as of update 35, their upside may not be worth the extra risk and effort that is involved. There are many other options available that get very similar results that don't require the resource management minigame that these two do. Riptide does still top out higher than something like Sororia, but only if you're keeping your stamina fairly low the whole encounter. And these two sets have become increasingly more difficult to use with hybridization, as we have a decent split of our resources, and finding that right balance to keep one low without it running out or without having too much regen into that resource can be tricky for sure. So all in all, these are still S tier sets because of the upside they have, but personally I have not been using them as much as of update 35. The results are just too similar to other combos that are a bit more relaxing to play with for me personally. I definitely wouldn't decon these. You never know when ZOS will tweak things, and if you want to play that resource minigame, they are definitely still strong, but ultimately that's up to you and what you're comfortable with. All right, that's it for the S tier. Now it's time for the ultimate S tier. Yes, there is an even higher S tier that adds even more damage than the S tier sets, and that is the support tier. Now, I won't go too in depth into these because I actually already did a video in the last year covering the top support set options for DPS, and we haven't really had any new ones introduced since then. So make sure to check that out if you want a little more in-depth rundown. But these are all very common support options to run on a DPS and can have a very nice impact on your total group damage levels. Many of the 5-piece bonuses are not too crazy far off from what you get from a selfish set, but the whole group gets to benefit from it. So kind of a no-brainer to get these going in your group if you can coordinate that. And then finally, we have the ultra super secret tier that I failed to mention that I would list. Here is a separate category of some of the top heavy attack sets. Not a playstyle that I typically cover as it just isn't my favorite, but I know a lot of folks out there do enjoy it, and that kind of playstyle did get a pretty hefty buff in comparison to other playstyles with the update 35 Lost Depths patch. Big thanks to Luke for helping me out with some of these listed here. Make sure to check out his YouTube channel for some great solo content. But yeah, you don't necessarily have to go with 2 of these if you are doing a heavy attack build. You could just do 1 and pair it with one of the other sets listed, like a trial set such as Reliquin, or if you are an Oaken Soul, that would open you up to pretty much pair whatever you'd like together. And those are my top DPS sets in the Elder Scrolls Online. People sometimes say to me, why do you give so many options in your guides? Why don't you just tell me which set hits the hardest and I'll run that? And the simple fact is there really isn't a best in ESO. So if I just gave you one specific setup, sure, that might work well for you in some scenarios, but it might be awful in others. And I feel like that's a disservice to you all for me to not present the bigger picture. And I know not everyone wants to have to think about it on a deeper level, and that's why some of you want to come to a guide, but I've decided that isn't the route for me. As a build maker and a teacher, I want to educate and help others understand more. So if that isn't for you, there are lots of other videos out there that will just give you one setup to run, and maybe that's a bit easier for you to follow, and nothing wrong with that. Just not the direction that I prefer to go when doing guides for the Elder Scrolls Online. I'd rather talk about the why and let you make an informed decision so you can get the most out of your specific scenario. So I hope all of the info here was easy enough to digest, and maybe you learned something new today or got a better idea of how you want to set up your character. Thanks a bunch for stopping by. If you haven't already subscribed to the channel, it definitely helps out a ton. Let me know down in the comments any other sets you think should have made the list and why you think they're great. A big thanks to my current Patreon supporters and YouTube members. Link is in the description if you're interested in helping out that way. And a special thanks to Nicholas, Simon, Cougar's Bay and the Cougar City Guild, the Order of War Guild, Iffy, Cantankerous Cat, Shady, Blake1816, Mordecai1212, Santanico, Nolandia, Florian, Vidridi, Cha-Cha, and Unemployed. Thanks again for stopping by. I'll see y'all in the next one. Bye.